The most quintessential Mediterranean dessert is baklava. And I do have to say, we make a really delicious one. Lots of times if you get them out at a restaurant, they're store-bought and they're just sweet. So we're gonna add in some other elements, some other flavors to give this a little bit more depth of flavor. So I'm gonna start with my sugar and honey syrup here. So I already have my sugar and my honey. I have a couple of orange peels, but I'm going to add some lemon peel to that too, and I wanted to show you how to do that. So I'm just using a peeler here, and I am just cutting a nice long strip of lemon. Okay, we're adding lemon and orange to give a little brightness, but a little bit sweetness too. And I want about 2 or 3 of those lemon peels in there. The peeler does a really great job of just getting the very outer zest part. We're not getting down to the underneath part that's white, very bitter, called the pith. I'm gonna try and avoid that at all possible. Okay, and now we're just gonna add our water to that sugar syrup as well, and a couple of cinnamon sticks. We don't wanna just add some powdered cinnamon here because we just want the essence of the flavor. We don't want the actual cinnamon in there. So we're just going to bring that to a boil to help dissolve all of the sugar, and then we'll reduce it down to a simmer and just let all those flavors steep in there, just like you would steep tea in hot water. As I'm sure you know, there's always some kind of nut in baklava. Typically we just see walnuts, but actually in a lot of Greek baklavas, there's also pistachio. So I'm doing walnut and pistachio, just an equal ratio of both. And I'm going to toast this in the oven before I add them to my recipe, because toasting the nuts brings out all the essential oils and makes them taste a little bit crunchier as well. So I just want to give a leg up on the cooking process by popping them in the oven. Now I do have just my walnuts and pistachios, but I've used a variety of different nuts. You can use seeds in there as well. It's a great opportunity to use up the little dribs and drabs of things that you may have in your cabinet. My nuts were toasting in the oven at 350 for about 9 to 10 minutes. You can also do that in a dry saute pan over about medium-high heat. Just keep a close eye on it because nuts love to burn very, very quickly, which is why I always set a timer if I toast them in the oven. I do feel like they get a little bit more even roast in the oven as opposed to on the stovetop, but on the stovetop I can keep an eye on them and I don't forget about them. Just don't forget to set that timer because they can go from toasted and beautiful to burn in about a second. But these are perfect. You can smell the beautiful nutty qualities of both the nuts, and they're just lightly browned. They are going to go through further cooking, so we didn't want them to be too brown just yet, because then they could burn when we cook them in the baklava. Here is another great place where we can add in some more flavor that wouldn't be in a traditional baklava recipe. So I'm actually using salted butter instead of unsalted butter. The salt is very evenly distributed in the butter, and it's going to bring out the sweet flavors and make it actually have some taste instead of just sweet. So I have my butter melted, and I'm just going to mix some vanilla bean paste up into my butter. And if you don't have the paste, extract will work perfectly as well. So I have my phyllo out on my counter, and a wonderful tip for working with baklava is to wrap your counter in plastic wrap. So we just wet down our counter, and then that helps the plastic wrap stick to the counter, and it just makes for a much easier cleanup because we're going to be working with butter, so it can kind of get everywhere. So I have my defrosted phyllo sheet all laid out here. And you can just have your other stack of phyllo right next to you. Just make sure and have either a piece of plastic wrap or a kitchen towel that we're going to lay on top of there when we're not working with it, because phyllo can dry out very quickly because it's such a thin dough. So I like to use a silicone brush as opposed to a bristle brush to get my butter onto my phyllo sheets, because I think it just spreads out a little bit easier. So I dip my brush in my butter, let the butter drain down until it's not coming down in a stream anymore, and then I go through and just tap the butter on my finger, and that spreads it out nice and evenly. After I can see I have lots of dots all over my phyllo sheet, then I go back in and kind of wiggle it back and forth, and that spreads the butter out. This way you don't wind up soaking your phyllo sheets, and you don't wind up with a very, very greasy baklava. It's just going to be crispy and light and fabulous. All right, once you have coated that first sheet with butter, we're going to get another sheet on top of it. Now, if you have some cracks in your phyllo, like I do with this sheet, you can cheat. So I have one larger crack here. I'm just going to place that next phyllo sheet on top of the crack below it. Nobody's going to be any the wiser because they're all going to be stacked together. So I'm going to repeat this process. I'm going to do 5 sheets first, and then we're going to go in with our first layer of nuts. My nuts have cooled off enough to the point where I can work with them, so I put those in the bowl of my food processor. I had a little bit of cinnamon and sugar left over from another recipe, so I'm just going to reuse that. But obviously, if you don't have cinnamon and sugar, just follow what's in the recipe. And I'm going to add a little bit of cloves. These are ground cloves. I don't usually measure spices, but with cloves I am going to, because they are very strong. You don't want to add up too much to your recipe, and then it has a very, very strong flavor. So this is another fun thing that we're adding. This is a vanilla powder. We wouldn't want to use vanilla extract in this case because we don't want to add moisture to the recipe. But I want to add a little bit of the flavor, so that is a wonderful addition. If you don't have that, again, don't worry about it. But if you happen to have any, or you want to experiment with it, this is a fun time to try that. And as always, all of our sweet things still need some salt. We're going to add a little bit of kosher salt to that, and then we're going to give it a few quick pulses. Make sure this is pretty nice and fine, but you can have a few nice little chunks of nuts in there to give it a little bit more texture. I have my 5 layers of phyllo all covered with my butter. And make sure you cover that top layer with butter as well. And then I'm just going to go through and I'm going to lightly coat the surface with my nut mixture. After we are topped with our nuts here, we are going to do 2 sheets of phyllo with butter in between each one, 1 more layer of nuts, and then 2 more sheets of phyllo on top of that. So eventually we're going to have 2 layers of nuts on top. I have all my layers of my baklava built. Make sure you also butter the top layer, because not only is the butter going to create steam between the layers of phyllo and make it rise up and get nice and flaky, but it is also going to aid in the browning, so we definitely want to make sure and have some right on top. If you want to do the classic baklava that is typically in a baking dish, just build the baklava right in your baking dish. But I'm going to do some little cups in a mini muffin tin. So I'm going to try and get 24 pieces out of this sheet, and then I'll wind up with 12 individual baklavas because I'm going to stack 2 of those together. So since I have 1 longer side and 1 shorter side, I'm going to try and get 8 pieces out of the longer side and 6 pieces out of the shorter side. A great way to judge distance is to try and cut everything in half. So if I cut this in half, I know I need to get 4 out of each side. So I'll cut my half in in half, and then cut each of those halves in half. Then on the other side, it's much easier to, again, cut in half. I can judge that a little bit easier. And then cut each of those halves into thirds. Make sure we cut all the way through, and then I'll show you how to stack them up in our pan. All my little squares cut, and so I'm going to take 2 squares, and then I'm going to catty corner them like that, so it kind of winds up looking like a Star of David. And then I'm just going to push down in the middle into my mini muffin tin, and then we're going to wind up having little kind of flower looking cups of baklava. I'm going to put these into the oven at 350 until they're nice and golden brown. I'm going to start the timer at 10 minutes and check it at that point and see how we're looking. And now time for cleanup. Just take up that plastic wrap. Gotta love that. My 10-minute timer for my baklava went off, and the baklava was still pretty pale, so I put another 4 minutes on the timer, and after that timer went off, it was perfectly golden brown. You can see on the bottom, it gets really nice and brown, very, very flaky and crispy on top. And now I'm going to drizzle the top of that with that really beautiful honey syrup. Remember, it had the cinnamon stick and the orange and lemon peels in there. So if you like yours like I do and just lightly sweet, we just need a light coating of that honey syrup. But if you like it sicky sweet, like a lot of the baklavas that you'll see out at restaurants, you can give it a couple of douses of some of that sugar syrup. But I like to temper it with just a little bit of flaky sea salt right on top, and you'll be amazed how much it brings out the flavor of everything that is in that fun little treat.